I'm 63 years old. I've spent 40 of those years working with my hands, mostly outdoors. First in orchards up in Hawke's Bay, and later running a small landscaping business out of Tauranga. I know what honest work looks like. I know what respect looks like. And after 31 years of marriage, I thought I knew what my wife looked like too. Her name is Glennis. We met at a mate's barbecue in 1992 when she was 24 and I was 29. And she laughed at one of my terrible jokes before I'd even finished telling it, which I took as a good sign. We got married the following year at a little chapel in Te Puka. Just family and close friends, nothing fancy. We had 2 sons. We built a house. We did all the ordinary things that people do, and I was proud of all of it. Every last bit. For most of our marriage, Glennis worked part-time at a garden center, then a medical reception, then nothing for a few years when the boys were teenagers and needed someone around. When our youngest left home to study in Wellington, she decided she wanted something new. She was 51 by then, full of energy, said she'd been sitting still too long. She applied for an admin role at an engineering consultancy and got it the CBD, and got it within a week. I was genuinely pleased for her. I told her that myself, more than once. The first year was fine. Better than fine, actually. She came home talking about the job with real enthusiasm, learning new software, getting her head around the industry. She'd mention colleagues by name, and I'd half listen the way you do when someone's describing a world you're not part of. Then, about 14 months in, one name started coming up more than the others. Craig. At first it was casual things. Craig had sorted out an issue with the invoicing system. Craig had brought in a nice coffee cake on Friday. Craig had covered for her when she had that dentist appointment and her computer froze. Small stuff. Harmless sounding stuff. Then it shifted. Craig thinks I'm really funny, she said one evening. Craig says I've got a better grasp of the client database than people who've been there for years. Craig and I always end up on lunch at the same time. It's like we're on the same schedule. I remember the first time I felt something uncomfortable sitting in my chest when she said his name. I didn't say anything. I told myself I was being ridiculous. She'd worked with plenty of people over the years, and none of it had ever meant anything. I was being one of those insecure older husbands who couldn't cope with his wife having a life outside the house. I pushed it down and said nothing. But the thing about a feeling like that is it doesn't stay pushed down, it just gets heavier. By the time they'd worked together for 2 years, Craig had become a constant presence in our house without ever setting foot in it. She'd come home, and the first 20 minutes of conversation were almost always about something Craig had said or done that day. She started using phrases I'd never heard her use before, turns of phrase that didn't sound like her, and one time when I pointed that out, half jokingly, she laughed and said, "Oh, Craig says that all the time. It must be rubbing off on me." I said, "That's a bit of an odd thing to let rub off on you." She looked at me like I'd said something peculiar. "It's just a saying." I let it go. I always let it go. There was a conference in Auckland. She'd been to a few work things over the years. Nothing unusual about it. This one was 3 days, and Craig was going too, along with 2 other colleagues, she mentioned. Though their names never came up again in any conversation before or after. I had a slightly sick feeling in my stomach the whole time she was away. She texted me when she arrived, and once the next morning. And then I didn't hear much until she was on her way home. When she got back, she was different. There's no other word for it. She was brighter, more animated, full of stories from the conference, but all the stories had Craig in them. Craig's presentation went brilliantly. Craig had everyone in stitches at the dinner on the second night. Craig found this amazing little restaurant on the waterfront, and they'd all gone there after the conference wrapped up. "Sounds like a great trip," I said. "It really was," she said. "Craig's just one of those people who makes everything more fun. You know?" I didn't know. And I didn't feel great about not knowing. I didn't say anything that night. I didn't say anything the night after that either. What I did do a few days later, was ask her gently if she thought the amount of time she spent talking about Craig was something she'd considered. I wasn't accusing her of anything. I was raising it the way you raise something you're uncertain about with a person you've been married to for nearly 30 years. She bristled immediately. Told me I was being jealous and small-minded. Told me Craig was just a colleague and a friend, and that I should be glad she had good people around her at work, instead of trying to make it into something it wasn't. She was so confident about it, so utterly dismissive of any concern I had, that I started wondering again if the problem was me. I went quiet after that. Not cold, not angry, just quiet. I withdrew my concerns and kept them to myself and kept an eye on things privately. Because what else do you do when the person you're trying to talk to refuses to hear you? We have a tradition with 3 other couples we've been close to for years, Ross and Donna, and Pete and Linda. We've known all of them since before the boys were born. We try to get together every couple of months for a meal or a game night or both, rotating whose place it's at. In autumn it was our turn to host, and we set up the long table in the living room for a board game night. Pete had brought over this new strategy game he'd picked up, something with resources and territory, and we were dividing into teams. Glenys chose Craig. That's not how it was supposed to work. Craig wasn't part of our group. He'd never been to our home before. But Glenys had invited him. She'd mentioned it the week before, so casually that I hadn't really registered what she was saying, and now he was standing in my living room looking very comfortable, and when it came time to split into pairs for the game, Glenys moved to stand beside him without a second's hesitation. "We've played this before," she said to the table, with a little smile. "We make a good team." Ross raised an eyebrow. Donna made a small noise that I couldn't quite read. I was standing across the table with a handful of game pieces, and I felt something go very cold and very still inside me. "When did you play it before?" I asked. "At the conference," she said. "There was a big game night on the second evening. Craig and I were partners, and we absolutely dominated." She looked at him and laughed. And he laughed too. Easy and comfortable. Like this was all completely normal. I smiled. Not a real smile. I don't know if anyone could tell the difference. "Fair enough," I said. "I'll go with Pete then." The game went on for a couple of hours. I played. I drank 1 beer. I watched. Glenys and Craig were in constant conversation, not just about the game, about everything, leaning toward each other, finishing each other's sentences, sharing references that went over everyone else's heads. At one point, she told a story from the conference that I hadn't heard before, something that had happened between just the 2 of them on a walk along the waterfront, and she was laughing so hard she could barely get through it. Nobody else in the room laughed like that. Ross caught my eye at one point and then looked away too quickly. At the end of the night, when Craig had gone and Ross and Donna and Pete and Linda had said their goodbyes slightly more subdued than usual, slightly more careful about what they said, I cleaned up the kitchen while Glenys sat on the couch going through her phone. "That was a good night," she said. "Was it?" I said. Something in my voice must have landed differently, because she looked up. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," I said. "Tired." I wasn't tired. I was thinking. I'd been carrying a feeling for months that I couldn't shake, and that night had crystallized something I hadn't wanted to look at directly. The way she moved to stand beside him. The way she laughed. The stories I hadn't been told. The walk on the waterfront. I wasn't imagining it. I knew what I'd seen. I'm not a person who makes decisions quickly. I spent 40 years in physical work where you learn to assess a situation before you act, because acting on a half-understood problem usually makes it worse. So I didn't say anything to Glenys. I didn't confront, didn't accuse. I started paying attention in a different way. Her phone had always sat on the kitchen bench when she was home. We'd never had that kind of marriage where people hid their devices, never felt the need to. But a few weeks after the game night, I noticed she'd started carrying it with her everywhere. To bed, to the bathroom, She'd go into the laundry to fold washing and come back 10 minutes later, phone in hand. One evening she left it on the bench while she went out to the garden, and a message came through from Craig. I could see the first line of it. Just a few words. I won't repeat what it said, but it wasn't something a colleague sends to a colleague. I put the phone back exactly where she'd left it. I didn't touch it. And I went outside and stood in the garden for a while until I could breathe normally again. I'm going to be honest about something. My first instinct wasn't rage. It wasn't even grief. Exactly. It was a kind of exhausted clarity, the feeling of a door swinging open on something you'd already suspected was on the other side. And the main emotion being a grim recognition. Oh, so that's what it was. There it is. The next day I started going through things quietly and carefully. Bank statements are joint in our household, and I have access to everything. I went back through the previous 6 months. There were charges I didn't recognize: a restaurant in Auckland's Viaduct area, the kind of place that doesn't do $18 pastas, a hotel minibar charge that was separate from the official conference accommodation. A weekend about 3 months ago when she'd told me she was going to visit her sister in Hamilton, and there was a fuel charge from a service station near Rotorua that made no sense for that route. I didn't go looking for drama. I just looked at what was in front of me. I have a mate. His name is Evan. We've known each other since we were young, blokes working the same orchard, and his daughter works in employment law. I rang him on a Tuesday morning. Not to tell him everything. Just to ask a general question about what happens when two people who work at the same company are in a relationship that's been concealed. He said he'd get her to give me a ring. She did. She was straightforward about it. Most companies, she explained, have policies around undisclosed relationships, particularly when one person is involved in supervising or referring work to the other. Craig wasn't Glennis's manager, but she'd learned that he'd been the one who'd recommended her for a project team twice. She'd received a small bonus off the back of one of those placements. That, apparently, created a different kind of issue. If someone were to notify HR, she said carefully, with documentation, it would be worth ensuring the documentation clearly shows both the relationship and any professional advantage one party received because of the other. Right, I said. I'm not telling you what to do, she said. I'm just answering your question. I know, I said. Thank you. I took my time. I'm deliberate like that. Always have been. I didn't move fast. I sat with what I knew for 2 more weeks, going about my normal life, being normal with Glennis, not letting on. Some people might say that's calculated. Maybe it is. But I also think that when your marriage of 31 years might be ending, you're allowed to be sure before you do anything irreversible. I put together a folder on my computer. Bank statements. Cross-referenced with dates she'd told me she was somewhere else. The screen grab I'd managed of that partial message, which I'd later looked at more carefully when she'd left her phone unlocked on the nightstand. A record of the 2 project placements. And the bonus she'd received. Nothing invasive. Nothing I'd had to break into or steal. All of it was available to me through legitimate means, either because it was joint property or because she'd left it visible. I emailed everything to the HR manager at her company on a Wednesday morning. From my personal email, with a short covering note explaining that I was the spouse of an employee, that I believed there was an undisclosed personal relationship between 2 staff members, and that I thought the company should be made aware of the relevant financial implications. Then I closed the laptop, made myself a cup of tea, and went out to do some work in the garden. I didn't hear anything for the rest of that day. Or Thursday. On Friday morning, Glennis's phone rang at 7:45 while she was in the shower. I could hear her come out quickly, answer it, and then there was silence for a long time. When she came into the kitchen 15 minutes later, she was dressed, but her face was different. Tight. Controlled in a way that meant she was trying very hard to be controlled. I have to go in early, she said. Everything all right? I asked. Fine, she said. Just something they need to sort out before the day starts. I didn't say anything. She came home at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. She had not been at work. She walked in the front door and stood in the hallway, and I was in the kitchen, and I looked at her, and I could see it the moment she understood. "Did you do this?" she said. Her voice was very quiet. Not loud. Not the kind of confrontation I might have expected. Just quiet. And something underneath it that I couldn't quite name. "I found out what was going on," I said. "I reported what I found. They've put us both on immediate leave," she said. "Pending investigation. That's both of us, not just." She stopped. Started again. "Craig's been told to stay away from the office. His team leader role is under review." "How could you do this?" I looked at her for a moment. I wasn't angry. I wasn't triumphant. I was just very, very tired. "I talked to you about Craig 8 months ago," I said. "I told you I was uncomfortable. You told me I was small-minded. That has nothing to do with—" I asked you again a few months after that. You shut it down. You made me feel like I was the problem." She didn't answer. "I found a message on your phone, Glennis. I saw the bank statements. I know about Hamilton." She sat down on the chair in the hallway, slowly, like her legs weren't quite working. There was a long silence. "What happens now?" she finally said. "I don't know what happens with your work," I said. "That's not in my hands anymore. As for here, I think you should go and stay somewhere else for a while. I think we both need some space to think." She looked up. "Where am I supposed to go?" I said it plainly. I wasn't trying to be cruel. I was just stating what I thought would happen. "I'd imagine Craig has a place." Something moved across her face. "Craig and his partner separated 2 years ago," she said. "He's been renting a room from a colleague." "Right," I said. "He said he was working on getting somewhere of his own." I didn't say anything to that. "He said a lot of things," she said, more quietly. And I understood from her tone that Craig, now suspended and under investigation, and apparently not in possession of the private flat he'd implied, he had perhaps not been entirely straightforward with her either. She packed a bag that afternoon and went to stay with her sister. The actual sister, in Hamilton this time. I know because I saw the travel on the app we share for petrol points, and because her sister rang me the following morning to say Glennis had arrived safely, and to tell me she was sorry all this had happened. I thanked her. I meant it. She's a decent woman, and none of this was her doing. I spent that Saturday doing the kind of things I always do on a Saturday, mowing the back lawn, cleaning out the ute, putting a new washer on the laundry tap that had been dripping for 3 weeks. I'm better when my hands are busy. I've always been that way. That night, my younger son rang from Wellington. He'd heard from his mum. He wasn't angry with me, but he was upset, and he wanted to understand what had happened. I told him as straightforwardly as I could. I didn't dress it up, didn't make myself the hero of it, just described what I'd found out and what I'd done. He was quiet for a while after I'd finished. "Are you okay, Dad?" he asked. "I'm all right," I said. "I'm sad about it, but I'm all right. What do you think's going to happen?" "I don't know yet," I said. "We'll have to see." He said he'd come up the following weekend, and I told him I'd appreciate that. In the days that followed, I heard from Ross. He said he'd had a feeling for a while that something wasn't right. He said he was sorry. He hadn't said anything. I told him I wasn't sure it would have made a difference. If he had these things have to work themselves out in their own time, I think. You can't act on a feeling. You can only act on what you know. A friend of mine who's been through a divorce said something to me once, years ago, that I've thought about a lot since all this happened. He said the hardest part isn't the betrayal itself. It's the revision, going back through your memories and reevaluating all the moments you misread, all the times you chose to believe the easier explanation. He said it was like someone had handed you a photograph of your life and told you the lighting was different from what you'd thought. That's accurate. I'll grant him that. But here's the other thing I've come to believe. And I want to say this clearly, because I think it matters. I spent 8 months trying to raise my concerns through the front door, talking to my wife directly, naming my discomfort, asking her to hear me. She chose not to. She made me feel small for asking. That is not something I'm willing to take responsibility for. When the front door is closed to you, you're not obligated to just stand outside in the cold indefinitely. You find another way. And some people, not many, but some will read this and say I went too far, that I should have just left the marriage without involving her workplace. Maybe. I've thought about that, but here's what I keep coming back to. She had received a financial benefit, an actual bonus, because of a relationship her employer didn't know about. That's not just a personal betrayal, that's a professional one. I didn't invent the rules. The company had them before any of us arrived. Glenys has been at her sister's for 3 weeks now. We've spoken a few times on the phone. There's no shouting, no performance. She's not the kind of person who shouts, and neither am I. There's just a very long conversation that hasn't really started yet about what comes next for two people who've been together since they were young and have no idea how to be separate. I don't know what I want yet. I'm 63. I'm not in a hurry to make a decision I can't take back. I'm going to give myself time to sit with it. What I do know is this. I will not be made to feel foolish for asking for respect. I asked for it. It wasn't given. I won't be asking again. If there's anything I'd say to someone else who finds themselves in a similar place, and I know it feels strange, a man my age talking about this sort of thing, because we weren't raised to, it's this. The discomfort you feel early on, the thing you keep pushing down because it seems too small or too uncertain or too easily dismissed, that's not nothing. That's something. Pay attention to it before it gets so heavy you can barely carry it. Trust is built over years. It can be broken in a moment. But what breaks a person more than the betrayal itself is the period between when they first sensed something was wrong and when they finally allowed themselves to act on it. Don't let that period be longer than it has to be. You don't need a courtroom standard of proof to know when something isn't right in your own home. You just need the courage to say so. And if nobody will hear you say it, the courage to act on it anyway. I'm 63 years old. I've spent a lifetime being steady and patient and building things slowly. I'm still that person. But I've also learned, later than I should have, that being patient doesn't mean being invisible, and being steady doesn't mean standing still while the ground shifts under your feet. You're allowed to name what's happening to you. You're allowed to do something about it, and you're allowed to still be standing at the end of it, with your dignity intact, looking out at your garden on a Saturday morning thinking, I did the right thing. I gave it every chance. It wasn't enough. And that wasn't my fault. That's where I am. That's where I'm staying for now. I've been thinking a lot lately about cause and effect. Not in any grand philosophical way. I'm a practical man, always have been, but in the quiet, ordinary way that you think about things when you're 63, and sitting in a house that's suddenly very still. What happened with Glenys didn't happen because of one decision, or one trip to Auckland, or one game night where she stood beside the wrong person and laughed too freely. It happened because of a long chain of smaller choices, hers and mine both. She chose, again and again, to let something grow that she should have cut back. And I chose, again and again, to stay quiet when I should have spoken. We were both building toward an outcome that neither of us fully admitted we were building toward. That's the part that stays with me. Not the betrayal itself, but the period before it, all those months where I had a feeling I couldn't shake, and I kept talking myself out of it. I told myself I was being insecure. I told myself she'd earned the right to her own friendships. I told myself that raising it again would only cause another argument. And so I waited. And while I waited, the thing I was worried about kept growing. There's a kind of cowardice in that, and I say that about myself without flinching. Not the dramatic kind of cowardice. I wasn't afraid of a fight. It was the quieter kind. The cowardice of not wanting to know for certain, because if I never looked directly at it, I could still pretend it might be nothing. What I've come to understand is that intelligence, real intelligence, the kind that actually helps you live your life, isn't just about being clever or knowing things. It's about being willing to see what's in front of you, even when seeing it is uncomfortable. I knew something was wrong 8 months before I did anything about it. That wasn't wisdom. That was avoidance dressed up as patience. The ethical question I've wrestled with is whether what I did going to HR, laying out the documentation, was the right thing. Some people would say it was too much, that I should have simply left, and I've sat with that honestly. But here's what I keep returning to. Glenys had received a financial benefit that came directly from a relationship her employer didn't know existed. That's not just a matter between two people. That involves a third party, her company, her colleagues, the integrity of the workplace who had no say in any of it. I didn't set those rules. I just didn't pretend they didn't exist. The thing about living with integrity isn't that it always feels good. Sometimes it feels like standing in a cold wind with nothing to shelter behind. I didn't feel triumphant when I sent that email. I felt sad and certain and very alone, but I also felt like myself. And that mattered more than I expected it to. To anyone going through something similar, I'd say this simply: your discomfort is data. The feeling you keep pushing down, the thing you keep explaining away, pay attention to it. Not to punish anyone, not to build a case, but because you deserve to live in honesty. And that starts with being honest with yourself about what you're actually experiencing. Strength isn't the absence of hurt. It's the willingness to keep going steadily, to act from your values rather than your fear, and to stay standing at the end of it with your sense of yourself intact. I'm still standing. That's enough for now.